Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, or Nikita Sergeyson Khrushchev, was born in April 1894 in Kalinovka, Kursk Governorate, Russian Empire, and died in September 1971, aged 77, in Moscow. He was married 3 times. First to Yefrosinya Khrushcheva from 1914 until her death in 1919, then to Marusya Khrushcheva in 1922. They separated, and then finally to Nina Khrushcheva, or Kukharchuk by her maiden name, from 1923 until his death in 1971. They had 5 children. He became, after 6 months of power struggles following Stalin's death, the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the country's effective dictator, in September 1953, and then even the country's prime minister in March 1958. He was dismissed or forced to resign from both offices in October 1964, because there was a conspiracy led by Mr. Leonid Brezhnev and joined by such fellow Soviet politicians as Alexei Kosygin and Nikolai Podgorny. Compared to Stalin, who was a secretive and suspicious and brutal person who suspected many people and did not like dealing much with foreigners, in practice did not like dealing that much with ordinary fellow Soviets either. Khrushchev was, at least by his outward image, a much more approachable man. He could laugh, dance, sing, and joke around. He joked that even the capitalist cows had or produced a more greasy milk. I'm sorry, even the communist cows produced more greasy milk than the capitalist cows. And he was famous in the United Nations General Assembly Hall in New York for banging his shoe allegedly on the table and then shouting abuse, calling someone a lackey, and even by a nastier name, which I don't want to repeat, while the other delegate was speaking. He instituted somewhat of a rollback, in some aspects quite much of a rollback from Stalin's persecutions. Clearly fewer people were directly executed on his orders. However, still many thousands continued to linger in the Soviet prisons. And despite the thaw, for example, the religious freedom remained still notably curtailed. However, the artistic freedom, for example, in terms of literature, was to some extent improved, and his so-called secret speech at the 1956 Congress or convention of the Soviet Communist Party, where he denounced Stalin as a brutal dictator, while stopping short of claiming that the Soviet communist system itself was to some extent responsible for Stalin's brutality or encouraging it, did encourage more openness. He made various visits to countries outside the Soviet Union. This was in direct contrast with Stalin, who only made a few or some. However, as the early 1960s wore on, he did suffer some humiliations, most notably in the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, when the young US President John Kennedy essentially was threatening the Soviet Union with military retaliation unless it stopped shipping missiles to Cuba. And Khrushchev, despite being some 23 years older than Kennedy, and despite allegedly presiding over, at least allegedly presiding over a huger military arsenal than Kennedy, was the one who backed down. He, in fact, according to the Grimberg History of Nations, wrote such an emotional and incoherent letter to Kennedy during the decisive, crucial days of that crisis that Kennedy, in order not to embarrass his rival, decided not to publish it. It has been alleged by certain Christians that Khrushchev may have had a religious side to him. I heard, maybe one of my teachers back in the 1980s say that Khrushchev once said, there is an old Russian folk saying or proverb that says, it is more blessed to give than to receive. In fact, he was quoting from one of the gospel books. And I've heard a story from one now officially retired Finnish preacher and ministry leader and writer that Khrushchev would actually have got baptized by a Russian Orthodox priest on his deathbed. And this priest, who was then a young priest, had recalled how Khrushchev had, probably in 1959 when visiting the United States, officially mockingly answered a journalist who had asked him what the future of Christianity in the Soviet Union would be, that before he was to die, there would be only one Christian left in the Soviet Union, and he would then ride through the 11 time zones of the Soviet Union with this single remaining Soviet Christian, and there would be that huge sign, thus will end Christianity in the Soviet Union. But that was definitely far from the truth. When he was deposed, forced to resign in October 1964 by this troika or trio of Brezhnev, Kosygin and Podgorny, he was allowed to retire to his apartment and to his Dutch or country house. He died almost 7 years later. He was able to secretly or half secretly dictate his memoirs, which were then published in 1970, so 1 year before his death, under the title Khrushchev Remembers. He offered little effective resistance to his dismissal. He preferred to live out his years quietly as a pensioner, to resisting the dismissal, which could at least have landed him in jail and possibly could even have resulted in his execution. He had the dream of so-called agrogoroda, or agricultural cities or towns, which however proved much more difficult to implement than to envision, especially in the Soviet Central Asia. In fact, he was accused of having instituted harebrained schemes. The official reasons were his advanced age. He was 70 at the time, and his declining health. And he became a largely unknown person. He was even removed from one edition of the Soviet Encyclopedia. When he eventually died, the Soviet Communist Party's main organ, the newspaper Pravda, or Truth, mentioned his death by a single sentence. Notably, back to the progress of the early Soviet space program, resulting in Mr. Yuri Gagarin becoming the first human being to circle the Earth via the space. Interestingly, when the purges were going on, he never protested, but then again, if he had protested, probably he would have also been killed. The official reason for his death was a heart attack.